I am Kori Schake, the Deputy Director General of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and this is Sound Strategic, our podcast to showcase the outsized talents of the research team here at the Institute. And it's my great pleasure today to have Névine Schepers with us. She is a research associate in the Non-Proliferation and Arms Control program. She's the anchor of that program here in London because, of course, as our listeners know, we have offices in London, Bahrain, Washington, Singapore, and soon Berlin, and we are a distributed and consciously international organization. Névine's expertise is on Iran, all aspects of the nuclear agreement. She wrote her master's thesis on Chinese and European involvement in the Iranian joint JCPOA. Mm-hmm. I always get the acronym garbled, but she did her graduate work at Sciences Po and at Fudan University in Shanghai, and I am super humbled to report the number of languages she speaks. I imagine, being Belgian, that 3 languages is an outsized and extraordinary, but you speak 5, so even by Belgian standards, that's outstanding. Névine, thank you so much for coming on Sound Strategic.
Thank you, Kori, for having me.
So as our listeners know, we have a standard set of questions that we go through each time to give consistency and clarity to the program. And the first one that we always ask people is, what about your work is hot in the news right now, which is kind of an almost ironic question given the work that you do, Névine.
Yes, I must say there are a lot of different topics that are currently in the news, ranging from North Korea, the Iran nuclear agreement, the future of arms control, whether multilateral or bilateral. But I've actually been working a lot on civil nuclear energy exports. So the subject I've been following a lot is Saudi Arabia's civil nuclear energy program, and a lot of the media attention it's been getting in the last few weeks.
So this is a subject I don't know nearly enough about. So give me remedial lessons. Who in the region has nuclear power? Who built the nuclear power plants people in the region have? Should we be nervous about what's going on with the Saudis? And what does it all mean for proliferation?
So at the moment, Iran is the only country with a nuclear energy program. Its currently operating reactor was built by Russia. Many other countries have expressed intentions of building a nuclear energy program. Saudi Arabia, but also Jordan. But
wasn't there a U.S. conversation with the UAE some years ago too?
Of course, the UAE as well has a nuclear program that is starting very soon. It's not currently in operation, but it's being built by the South Koreans, and we are currently, I think, waiting for it to become operational. I think later this year. There's been a few delays, but yeah. In the case of Saudi Arabia, though, I think it has had plans to construct nuclear reactors for quite some time. I think starting already in the beginning of 2010, has had various different negotiations in place with the Chinese, the Russians, the French, the South Koreans, and of course with the United States. And the particularity of negotiating with the United States is, in order for the U.S. to export nuclear technology, you need to have what's called a 1-2-3 agreement in place. And when the United States negotiated one with the United Arab Emirates, it managed to get a lot of, let's say, very specific restrictions in place for what are the most dangerous aspects of a nuclear energy program, which are uranium enrichment and plutonium reprocessing. But when it's been negotiating with Saudi Arabia, it's been very clear that Saudi Arabia is not interested in having any additional restriction placed on these technologies, which has made the US, but also the rest of the international community, a bit worried. And in the last few weeks, we've heard reports coming from Congress that the Trump administration has perhaps try to bypass the checks and balances that are in place to assure that there are very strong proliferation standards in any, say, agreement between the United States and a third country.
So it's always a relevant question with regards to the government of my sweet provincial country, but it's especially sharp these days. What is Congress's role versus the executive in these agreements? Can the president, by executive order, make this deal with the Saudis, or does Congress have to either approve it with treaty provisions or approve the authorization and appropriation of money for it?
So the State Department, with support from the Department of Energy, is the negotiating party on behalf of the United States for a 1-2-3 agreement. And once it is negotiated, it has to go through Congress. And so Congress has a 90-day, I believe, time window in order to either reject it or just let it pass. If they do reject it, it then goes through another process where the president, I believe, does have some executive power there to overturn any rejection based on national security grounds. But at the moment, most 1-2-3 agreements have passed through Congress in this way. But there is a push at the moment to not just have a 1-2-3 agreement go through Congress, but actually require the formal approval of Congress. So there is a lot of push at the moment, especially given, let's say, recent events in Saudi Arabia that have had the Congress quite worried about the sale of nuclear technology.
So by recent events, do you mean the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in Turkey by the government of Saudi Arabia? Do you mean the execution of 37 Saudis by the government as terrorists, and including the post-execution crucifixion of at least one of them? Do you mean the war in Yemen? Is that the entirety of the charge sheet, or are there specific concerns about Saudi Arabia and nuclear energy that are weighing on congressional approval?
I think the war in Yemen has had an effect, but I must say was with the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi that I think there's been a lot more scrutiny on, let's say, the possible agreement or negotiation of such an agreement with Saudi Arabia. Then again, last year there had been, let's say, in an interview with CBS, when the Prince Mohammed bin Salman was asked whether Saudi Arabia would ever produce nuclear weapons, he said, if Iran goes in that direction, so will Saudi Arabia. So this has been sort of a reminder that there is a risk, and the fact that they are refusing to restrict, in an agreement with the United States, their rights to enrich and reprocess it, which are, I must insist, are the two dangerous technologies when it comes to nuclear power. I'd say these two facts have gotten people quite worried, yes.
And given the amount of work you have done on the Iranian nuclear agreement, how strong is the connection between the administration's rejection of the Iran agreement and potential concerns about Iran's nuclear weapons program, stoking a cascade of proliferation in the region? Because that was one of the initial arguments that many people, including me, who had misgivings about the agreement, supported it, because we were so much more worried about the potential for the cascade if Iran should continue to make progress across the nuclear threshold. Do you see any connection between what's going on with the Saudis and the withdrawal from the Iranian nuclear agreement, or are they separate issues?
There are connections, of course, but I see the Trump administration's current position on the Iran nuclear agreement to be extremely counterproductive, in the sense, should the Iran nuclear agreement fail, there are no more checks and balances to the extent that they are currently in place through additional inspections that the International Atomic Energy Agency can do. There are much more limited, let's say, verification possibilities on Iran's nuclear program, which has been certified numerous times since the nuclear deal was implemented.
To be in compliance. Yeah,
So,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No.
One of the reasons I supported the JCPOA with misgivings, but supported it, was the inspection provisions were so much better than we were going to get without the agreement.
Mm-hmm.
And if you really believe the United States was going to preventatively attack the Iranian nuclear weapons program at some point in time, those inspections would be invaluable intelligence gathering opportunities that are not available to us now that we have withdrawn from the agreement. Given the work that you did on China and the European Union with the JCPOA, how do you anticipate the Trump administration's announcement that they will give no further waivers for Iranian oil to reach the market? What do you think the Europeans and Chinese, how will they likely react to that?
I think the Europeans will continue to support the nuclear agreement, and they will continue to, let's say, promote the instruments they've put in place to try and ensure trade with Iran can continue. For China, it would be actually quite interesting to see how they will react given the current trade, let's say, issues as well they're facing with the United States. We have seen them reduce their oil imports from Iran following last year's, let's say, the U.S.'s withdrawal of the Iran nuclear agreement and the subsequent reimplementation of sanctions. But how quickly they will be able to completely stop, and whether they intend to, whether they would be willing to face sanctions, I think will be quite an interesting
Yeah, I find myself a little bit more sympathetic to the Trump administration on no further waivers for Iranian oil. I find myself a little more sympathetic than most people, because the point of the waivers from the time the JCPOA was signed were in order to provide transition time away from Iranian oil to other purchases. And it has been, how many years has it been since the agreement went into force? Because the Clinton administration gave the first round of profligate waivers to India, Japan, China, everybody else, right? When did that happen?
Are you saying when did the Iran nuclear agreement come into force?
Yeah.
So in January 2016.
Okay, January 2016. Okay, so it's not as much time to make a major transition in your economy like finding alternative sources of oil imports. Okay, that's interesting. How did you become expert on this work, my friend? What got you interested in it?
So I initially did my undergrad degree in Asian studies with the intention of possibly becoming an interpreter at some point.
Is that right?
Yes.
So this explains the wild outsized proficiency with languages.
Yes, but the more I learned about different Asian countries' history, culture, and politics, the more I became interested, I think, in the foreign policy aspect of it. And I think it's very hard to study Asia without studying its relationship with nuclear weapons and with nuclear energy, particularly looking at Japan and China, but also, of course, India and Pakistan. And so I think it caught my interest as a subject, and I've since been learning how large this field is of non-proliferation and nuclear policy, and how much there is to learn, how many different niches there are, and it's been a learning experience every day, and a fantastic one at that.
Now, you've recently participated in the Carnegie Endowment's Non-Proliferation Workshop. Talk a little bit about what you learned in that experience.
I think the Carnegie Conference has been a very interesting experience because they are actively trying to promote young voices in the field and young researchers. They have, say, a separate workshop. They encourage mentorship, and I think in this particular field there might have been quite a gap between, let's say, researchers who are now in their 40s, 50s.
Oh my God, that's so true.
Now in their 20s, 30s. There's a bit of a gap there, and it's been very interesting to see these interactions between people from, let's say, my generation who have entered this field, let's say, in the last 5 years or so, and people who have been working on these issues for 50, 60 years, have followed the implementation and the negotiation of all these various treaties which today are fraying or in disarray. It was a very interesting conference, and I think it was important in, let's say, bringing light to let's say, constant stream of issues that have been in the limelight, especially in the last few years since Trump took office, unfortunately.
You're right that there is an enormous, almost a generation's gap in expertise, because the most salient questions of international security in the 1950s and 60s were the nuclear issues. How much do nuclear weapons change warfare? What are the careful intricacies of the operations of nuclear deterrence, or are there no careful intricacies? Is it a blunt tool for managing great power competition? And with the end of the Cold War, I think the field, just as the field of Russian studies, or what used to be Soviet studies, dried up a little, talented young people went into different aspects of security. And now it's back in fashion because we have to start worrying about it again. So what's your favorite book in your field, Névine?
This might be an unconventional answer given, let's say, the wealth of literature that exists. But I'd say one of my favorite books is actually called Uranium, and it's written by a journalist called Tom Zollner. It sort of traces the history and use of uranium. So you learn a lot about the economics, the mining industry, how it was central to, of course, nuclear weapons production, but also nuclear energy. And yeah, I thought it was quite an interesting, let's say, way to tie a lot of these issues together.
Oh, that's fascinating. I've never read it.
And because it's written by a journalist as well, the style is quite compelling. It's
Okay, now I am banging my shoe on the table like Khrushchev at the United Nations in objection to that. While it is true that many of the best analysts here at the IISS do come out of journalism, it is also not necessarily true that we academics are bad writers and our prose is inaccessible. I reject that flat out, both personally and as the research director of this fine, august institution. What's the conventional wisdom in your field that you think is wrong?
I think there are, let's say, two opposing conventional wisdoms that keep being referred to as a conventional wisdom, although they contradict each other. And one is that nuclear power reactors do not pose any proliferation risks. And the other is, of course, that nuclear power programs do increase the risks of nuclear weapons proliferation. So these two, let's say, competing theories are often being cited as a conventional wisdom.
So one or the other is the starting point, and you're saying they're both wrong?
I'm saying they're
both. Or they
both,
can't both be true?
I'm saying there's a right balance between the two. I think this ties back a little bit to what I was talking about in regards to Saudi Arabia. I think saying nuclear reactors as such do not pose a proliferation risk, okay, but there are various technologies associated with civil nuclear energy as well, which are dual use and are particularly uranium enrichment and plutonium reprocessing. So this all has to do with the fuel itself. And so the production of the fuel, and then once the fuel is used, how it is being used once it's used, in a sense. And so I think the risks are tied there. But then saying that nuclear energy programs will automatically lead to proliferation is wrong as well, because there are very tight checks and balances that have improved over the decades as new situations arose. And so Can
you give us an example of one of those? What's one that you think's a great innovation you were surprised it took as long as it did?
An innovation? I think there are both legal and technical innovations in a sense. I think reactors at the very beginning did pose certain proliferation risk, whereas the ones that are used today, either for research or for power production, use very, very low enriched uranium, and they cannot, as such as a reactor, be used for the production of weapons. But then on the legal side, the International Atomic Energy Agency has constantly improved its safeguards agreements that it negotiates with countries, and I think it learned a lot from Iraq, and so has since, for instance, been promoting the signing of an additional protocol that would give it a bit more power to detect whether illegal activities are taking place, not necessarily at the facilities that are listed, but in other places as well. So there are constant evolutions, and reactors today, people are trying to make them more proliferation resistant and incorporate more passive safety features in them, and it's been an interesting evolution, I'd say, to respond
That is
to
a magnificent series of innovations, and I love that you didn't take the question narrow and technically, that you took it big and broad and included the legal innovations that have been such an important part of the evolution of preventing nuclear proliferation. The additional protocol agreement of the IAEA, Iran, I had it right the first time. Iran had agreed to sign the additional protocol as part of the JCPOA,
so
right?
It's currently implementing it. So it has signed it but not ratified it, I believe. But as part of the JCPOA, it is implementing the additional protocol, let's say.
So if Iran should cease compliance with the JCPOA, we would lose the additional protocol safeguards that are currently being practiced by Iran.
Yes.
Excellent. That's a bracing thought. What's your favorite work you've ever done? Like, if you could point people to one thing of yours that would give a flavor for the work you do, what would it be?
So I've recently written a paper for the EU Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium on Russia's civil nuclear energy exports. And so it's been a bit of a culmination of a year's worth of research, and so it was quite an interesting experience putting it all down on paper. And it's been a case, let's say Russia as a civil nuclear supplier, how it's come to dominate the market, how it's being perceived. And in that paper, I tried to, let's say, examine whether these exports have very clear geopolitical implications, and whether the statement that often U.S. commentators say that Russian exports might lead to weaker nuclear governance compliance, so weaker nuclear safety or security norms, whether that's actually true. And it's been quite a trendy subject, let's say, in the last few years, mostly to show that Russia, but also China, have been gaining a lot of ground on the nuclear export market, and that most nuclear reactors in the next few years will probably be made with Russian or Chinese technology, and the US, but also others like France, are trailing behind. And so that argument is often used to say, if we don't improve, if the U.S. doesn't improve its nuclear exports, China and Russia will swoop in and take the market. And so bringing a little bit of nuance to these statements and to this analysis has been the paper I wrote.
That's great. What's the title of it?
It's called Russia's Nuclear Energy Exports, Status, Implications, and
that's far enough. If we Google that much of it, we can get it. On a scale of 1 to 10, how worried should we be about the Russian-Egyptian nuclear deal that just got signed?
On a scale of 1 to 10, I would say probably 5. I know that's not a very straightforward answer, but my worry is more about the fact that Egypt has made a point, like a political point, of not signing or implementing a lot of nuclear security and safety conventions and treaties, to sort of make a political point about it, to show that there is discrimination between nuclear weapon states, non-nuclear weapon states. And so my worry is more about the safety and security implications there. They, for instance, don't have an additional protocol in place. They do not follow a lot of the, let's say, international conventions in place on these very, very important issues. So, yeah.
That's really interesting that the weight of your concern is on the Egyptian side, not on the Russian side on that. Last question, Névine Schepers. What is your favorite data visualization?
This might sound a bit strange as well, but a time zone map.
Okay.
I'll preface this by saying I love maps. Maps of the world, maps of countries, of cities, and maps are never apolitical. Borders are unrecognized states, or they're all shown on maps, and there's always one side taken or another. But I've recently learned that time zones are also very political.
Yes, they are.
And deciding in which time zone a country is or isn't is a very political decision. North Korea last year finally joined South Korea's time zone, which I think was quite a positive sign in inter-Korean relations. But 2014, Crimea became part of the Russian time zone rather than the previously Ukrainian time zone, which is an hour behind. And China, all of China, which spreads across, I think, 4 or 5 different time zones, is actually just one time zone. So I never realized how political time was until I saw it on a map.
Okay, I love the way that you took a relatively simple data visualization and showed how political the concept behind this something we take for granted don't pay enough attention to. What a fabulous point to end this conversation on, Névine. I want to thank you for teaching me and our listeners about the Saudi nuclear energy program that's in the news these days, about some of the concerns about the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA, the Iranian nuclear agreement, for giving us the book Uranium to go read, to think about how these issues all connect around that central hub. For showing us how nuclear power, how innovations in both the legal structures and instruments that we use to safeguard against nuclear proliferation have advanced the cause of non-proliferation. And I'm just thrilled that you chose not a narrow technical interpretation of innovation, but one that's about concepts. And I think I see that as the thread through so much of what you have talked about today. I learned today what a fine conceptualizer you are, Névine, and I didn't appreciate that nearly enough about you before we had this conversation. I want to thank you so much for this conversation and for the superb work you do for the IISS, my friend.
Thank you, Kori. Thank you so much for having me.